Chapter 17 of The Mountain Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. The Mountain Girl by Payne Erskine. Chapter 17, in which David Thryng meets an enemy. The next day David gave his attention to the letters which he found awaiting him. One was from Dr. Hoyle in Canada. He had but just returned from a visit to England, and it was full of news of David's family there. "Your 2 cousins and your brother are gone with their regiments to South Africa," he wrote. "They are jubilant to be called to active service, as they ought to be, but your mother is heartbroken over their departure. You stay where you are, my boy. She is glad enough to have you out of England now, and far from the temptation which besets youth in times of war. It has already caused a serious blood-letting for old England. I have grave doubts about this contention. In these days there ought to be a way of preventing such disaster. Write to your mother and comfort her heart. She needs it. I was careful not to betray to her what your condition has been, as I discovered you had not done so. Hold fast and fight for health, and be content. Your recuperative power is good." David was filled with contrition as he opened his mother's letter, which was several weeks old and had come by way of Canada, since she did not know he had gone south. For some time he had sent home only casual notes, partly to save her anxiety and partly because writing was irksome to him unless he had something particularly pleasant to tell her. His plans and actions had been so much discussed at home, and he had been considered so censurably odd, so different from his relatives and friends in his opinions, and so impossible of comprehension, which branded him in his own circle at being quite at fault, that he had long ago abandoned an effort to make himself understood by them, and had retired behind his mask of reserve and silence to pursue his own course undisturbed. Thus, at best, an occasional perfunctory letter that all was well with him was the sum total of news they received. Thryng had no money anxieties for his family. The needs of his mother and his sister, not yet of age, were amply provided for by a moderate annuity, while his brother had his position in the army and help from his uncle besides. For himself, he had saved enough with his simple tastes and much hard work to tide him over this period of rest. David sat now and turned his mother's letter over and over. He read and reread it. It was very sad. Her splendid boys both gone from her, one possibly never to return, neither of them married and with no hope of grandchildren to solace her declining years. "Stay where you are, David," she wrote. "Dr. Hoyle tells us you are doing well. Don't enter the army. One son I have surrendered to my country service. Let me feel that I still have one on whom I may depend to care for Laura and me in the years to come. We do not need you now, but some day we may." David's quandary was how to give her as much of his confidence as filial duty required, without betraying himself so far as to arouse the antagonistic comment of her immediate circle upon his course. At last he found a way. Telling her he did not know how soon he might return to Canada, he requested her to continue to address him there. He then filled his letter with loving thoughts for her and Laura, and a humorous description of what he had seen and experienced in the States and the country about him, all so foreign and utterly strange to her as to be equal to a small manuscript romance. It was a cleverly written letter, so hiding the vital matters of his soul which he could not reveal even to the most loving scrutiny, that all her motherly intuition failed to read between the lines. The humorous portions she gave to the rector's wife, her most intimate friend, and the dear son's love expressed therein she treasured in her heart and was comforted. Then David rode away up the mountain without descending to his little farm. He craved to get far into the very heart of the wildest parts, For with the letters the old conventional and stereotyped ideals seemed to have intruded into his cabin. He passed the home of Hoke Belew and stopped there to see that all was well with them. The rose vine covering the porch roof was filled with pink blossoms, hundreds of them swinging out over his head. The air was sweet with the odor of honeysuckle. The old locust tree would soon be alive with bees, for it was already budded. He took the baby in his arms and saw that its cheeks were growing round and plump, and that the young mother looked well and happy, and he was glad. "Take good care of them, Hoke. They are worth it," he said to the young father as he passed him coming in from the field. "I will that," said the man. "Can you tell me how to reach a place called Wildcat Hole? I have a fancy to do a little exploring." "Well, it's sort of roundabout. I don't guess you can find it easy." The man spat, as if reluctant to give the information asked, which only stimulated David all the more to find the spot. "Keep right on this way, do I?" "Yes. You keep on for a spell, and then you turn to the right and foller the stream for a spell, and you keep on follering it off and on till you get there. You'll know it when you do get there, but the still's all broke up." "Oh, I don't care a rap about the still." "No, I reckon not. Better light and have dinner 'fore you go on. Azalie, keep the doc to dinner. I'm coming in a minute," he called to his wife, who stood smiling in the doorway. David willingly accepted the proffered hospitality, as he had often done before, knowing it would be well after nightfall ere he could return to his cabin, and rode back to the house. While Azalea prepared dinner, Hoke sat in the open door and held his baby and smoked. David took a splint-bottomed chair out on the porch and smoked with him, watching pleasantly the pride of the young father, who allowed the tiny fist to close tightly around his great work-roughened finger. "Look a there now. See that hand? It ain't bigger'n a bumblebee, and see how he can hang on." "Yes," said David, absently regarding them. "He's a fine boy." "He sure is. They ain't no finer in this mountain." Azalea came and looked down over her husband's shoulder. "Don't do that a way, Hoke. You'll wake him up, bobbing his arm up and down like you a doin'. Hoke, he's that proud you can't touch him." "You hear that, Doc? Azalie, she's that sot on him she'd like to turn me out'n the house fer just lookin' at him. She 'lows he'll grow up a preacher on account of the way he can holler and thrash with his fists, but I tell her it ain't nothin' but madness and devilment 'at gets in him." With a mother's superior smile playing about her lips, she glanced understandingly at David and went on with her cooking. As they came into the table, she called David's attention to a low box set on rockers, and taking the baby from her husband's arms, carefully placed him, still asleep, in the quaint nest. "Hoke made that hisself," she said with pride, "and Cassandry, she made that kiver." Thryng touched the cover reverently, bending over it, and left the cradle rocking as he sat down at Hoke's side and began to put fresh butter between his hot biscuit, as he had learned to do. His mother would have flung up her hands in horror had she seen him doing this, or could she have known how many such he had devoured since coming to recuperate in these mountain wilds. The home was very bare and simple, but sweet and clean, and love was in it. To sit there for a while with the childlike young couple, enjoying their home and their baby, and the hospitality generously offered according to their ability, warmed David's heart, and he rode away happier than he came. With mind absorbed and idle rein, he allowed his horse to stray as he would, while his thoughts and memory played strange tricks, presenting contrasting pictures to his inward vision. Now it was his mother reading by the evening lamp, carelessly scanning a late magazine, only half interested, her white hair arranged in shining puffs high on her head, and soft lace, old lace, falling from open sleeves over her shapely arms. And Laura, red cheeked and plump, curled feet and all in a great lounging chair, poring over a novel and yawning now and then, her dark hair carelessly tied, with straight straying ends hanging about her face, as he had many a time seen her after playing a game of hockey with her active, romping friends. His mother and Laura were the only ones at home now, since the big elder brother was gone. Of course they would miss him and be sad sometimes, but Laura would enjoy life as much as ever and keep the home bright with youth. Even as he thought of them, the room faded and his own cabin appeared as he had seen it the day before, through the open window, with Cassandra moving about in her quiet, gliding way, haloed with light. Again he could see the picture of another room, all white and gold, with slight French chairs and tables and couches and cushions and candelabra of quivering crystals, with pale green walls and gold-framed paintings, and a great three-cornered piano, massive and dark, where a slight fair girl sat idly playing tinkling music in keeping with herself and the room, but quite out of keeping with the splendid instrument. He saw people all about her, chatting, laughing, sipping tea, and eating thin bread and butter. He saw, as if from a distance, another man, himself, in that room, standing near the piano to turn her music, while the tinkling runs and glib, expressionless trills wove in and out, a ceaseless nothing. She spent years learning to do that, he thought, and any amount of money. Oh, well, she had it to spend, and of what else were they capable, those hands? He could see them fluttering carelessly over the keys, pink, slender, pretty. And then he saw other hands, somewhat work-worn, not small, nor yet too large, but white and shapely. Ah, of what were they not capable? And the other girl, in coarse white homespun, seated before the fire in Hoke Belew's cabin, holding in her arms the small bundle, and her smile so rare and fleeting. He saw again the handsome, sullen youth in Bishop Tower's garden, regarding him over the hedge with narrowed eyes, and his whole nature rebelled and cried out as before, "What a waste!" Why should he allow it to go on? He must thrash this thing out once for all before he returned to his cabin, the right and the wrong of the case, before he should see her again, while as yet he could be engineer of his own forces and hold his hand on the throttle to guide him safely and wisely. Could he succeed in influencing her to set her young lover's claims one side? But in his heart he knew if such a thing were possible, she would not be herself. She would be another being, and his love for her would cease. No, he must see her but little, and let the tragedy go on even as the bishop had said, go on as if he had never known her. As soon as possible he must return and take up his work where he could not see the slow wreck of her life. A heavy dread settled down upon him, and he rode on with bowed head until his horse stumbled and thus roused him from his reverie. To what wild spot had the animal brought him? David lifted his head and looked about him, and it was as if he had been caught up and dropped in an enchanted wood. The horse had climbed among great boulders and paused beneath an enormous overhanging rock. He heard off at one side the rushing sound of a mountain stream and judged he was near the head of Lone Pine Creek. But oh, the wilderness of the spot, and the beauty of it, and the lonely charm! He tied his horse to a lithe limb that swung above his head, and dismounting, clambered on towards the rushing water. The place was so screened in as to leave no vista anywhere, hiding the mountains on all sides. Light green foliage overhead, where branches thickly interlaced from great trees growing out of the bank above, made a cool, lucent shadowiness all around him. There was a delicious odor of sweet shrub in the air, and the fruity fragrance of the dark, wild wake robin underfoot. The tremendous rocks were covered with the most exquisite forms of lichen in all their varied shades of richness and delicacy. He began carefully removing portions here and there to examine under his microscope, when he noticed almost crushed under his foot a pale purple orchid like the one Cassandra had placed on his table. Always thinking of her, he stooped suddenly to lift the frail thing, and at the instant a rifle shot rang out in the still air, and a bullet meant for his heart cut across his shoulders like a trail of fire and flattened itself on the rock where he had been at work. At the same moment, with a bound of tiger-like ferocity and swiftness, one leaped toward him from a near mass of laurel, and he found himself grappling for life or death with the man who fired the shot. Not a word was spoken. The quick, short breathing and scuffling of feet among the leaves, and the snapping of dead twigs underfoot were the only sounds. Had the youth been a trained wrestler, David would have known what to expect, and would have been able to use method in his defense. As it was, he had to deal with an enraged creature who fought with the desperate instinct of an antagonist who fights to the death. He knew that the odds were against him, and felt rising within him a wild determination to win the combat, and thinking only of Cassandra, to settle thus the vexed question, to fight with the blind passion and the primitive right of the strongest to win his mate. He gathered all his strength, his good English mettle and nerve, and grappled with a grip of steel. This way and that, twisting, turning, stumbling on the uneven ground, with set teeth and faces drawn and fierce, they struggled, and all the time the light tweed coat on David's back showed a deeper stain from his heart's blood, and his face grew paler and his breath shorter. Yet a joy leaped within him. It was thus he might save her, either to win her or to die for her, for should Frale kill him, she would turn from him in hopeless horror, and David, even in dying, would save her. Suddenly the battle ended. Thryng's foot turned on a rounded stone, causing him to lose his foothold. At the same instant, with terrible forward impetus, Frale closed with him, bending him backward until his head struck the lichen-covered rock. The purple orchid was bruised beneath him, and its color deepened with his blood. Then Frale rose and looked down upon the pallid, upturned face and inert body which lay as he had crushed it down. As he stood thus, a white figure, bareheaded and alone, came swiftly through the wall of laurel which hid them, and pausing terror-stricken in the open space, looked from one to the other. For an instant Cassandra waited thus, as if she too were struck dead where she stood. Then she looked no more on the fallen man, but only at Frale, with eyes immovable and yet withdrawn, as if she were searching in her own soul for a thing to do, while her heart stood still and her throat closed. Those great gray eyes, with the green sea depths in them, began to glow with a cruel light, as if she too could kill, as if they were drawing slowly from the deep well of her being, as it were, a sword from its scabbard wherewith to cut him through the heart. Her hand stole to her throat and pressed hard. Then she lifted it high above her head and held it, as if in an instant more one might see the invisible sword flash forth and strike him. Frale cried out then, Don't curse me, Cass," and lifted his arm to shield his face, while great beads of moisture stood out on his face. "It's not for me to curse, Frale." Her voice was low and clear. "Curses come from hell, like what you've been carrying in your heart that made you do this." Her voice grew louder, and her hand trembled and shut as if it grasped something. "I take it back from God, the promise I gave you there by the fall." Then, looking up, her voice grew low again, though still distinct. "I take that promise back forever, oh God." Her hand dropped. The cruel light died slowly out of her eyes, and she turned and knelt by the prostrate man and began pulling open his coat. Frale took one step toward her. "Cass," he said with shaking voice, "I'll help you." Her hands clenched into David's coat as she held it. "Go back. Don't you touch even his least finger," she cried, looking up at him from where she knelt, like a creature hurt to the heart, defending its own. "You've done your work. Take your face where I never can see it again." He stood still and looked down on her. She turned again to David, and thrusting her hand into his bosom, drew it forth with blood upon it. "I say to you, Frale," she cried, holding it toward him, quivering with the ferocity she could no longer restrain, "leave here, or with this blood on my hand I'll call all hell to curse you." Frale turned with bowed head and left her there. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Mountain Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. The Mountain Girl by Payne Erskine. Chapter 18, in which David Thryng awakes. Thryng lay in Hoke Belew's cabin, not in the one great living room where were the fireplace and the large bed and the tiny cradle, but in the smaller addition at the side, entered only from the porch which extended along the front of both parts. He still lay on the litter upon which he had been placed to carry him down the mountain, an improvised thing made by stretching quilts across two poles of slender green pines. The litter was placed on low trestles to raise it from the floor, and close to the open door to give him air. David had not regained consciousness since his hurt, but lay like one dead, with closed eyes and blanched lips, yet they knew him to be living. Cassandra sat beside him alone. All night long she had been there, unsleeping, hollow-eyed, and worn with tearless grief. She had done all she knew how to do. Before going for help, she had removed his clothing and bound about his body strips torn from her dress to stop the bleeding of his shoulders where the silver bullet had torn across them. How the ball had missed giving a mortal wound was like a miracle. Hoke Belew had tried to arouse him, but had failed. At intervals during the night, Cassandra had managed to drop a little whiskey between his lips with a spoon, and she had bathed him with a stimulant over heart and lungs, and chafed his hands, and had tried to warm his feet by rubbing them and wrapping them up between jugs of hot water. She had bathed his bruised head and cut away the soft curling hair from the spot where his head had struck the rock. What more she could do she knew not, and now she sat at his side while chafing his hands and waiting for Hoke Belew's return. Hoke had gone to the station to telegraph for Bishop Towers. Fortunately, as the hotel was so soon to be open and the busy summer life to begin, the operator was already there. Azalea, in the great room, was preparing dinner, stopping now and then to touch her baby's cradle or to stoop a moment over the treasure therein. Aunt Sally sat in the doorway smoking her cob pipe and telling gruesome tales of how she had "seen people hurted that a way and never come out'n it." Sally had ridden over to give help and sympathy, but Cassandra had said she would watch alone. She had eaten nothing since the day before, only sipping the coffee Azalea had brought her. It was one of those breathless hours before a rain when not a leaf stirs, even the birds were silent. Cassandra tried once more to give David a few drops of the whiskey, and this time it seemed as if he swallowed a little. She thought she saw his eyelids quiver, and her heart pounded suffocatingly in her breast. She dropped beside him on her knees and once again tried to give him the only stimulant they had. This time she was sure he took it, and still kneeling there, she bowed her head and pressed her lips upon the hand she had been chafing. Did it move or not? She could not tell, and again she sat gazing in the still white face. Oh, the suspense! Oh, the joy that was agony! If this were truly the awakening and meant life! In her intensity of longing for some further signs, she drew slowly nearer and nearer, until at last her lips touched his. Then in shame she hid her face in the quilt at his side, and weak with the exhaustion of her long anguish and fasting and watching, she wept the first tears, tears of hope she was not strong enough to bear. As she thus knelt, weeping softly, his fluttering eyelids lifted, and he saw her there, and felt the quivering hand beneath his head. Not understanding how or why this should be, he waited perfectly still, trying to gather his thoughts. A great peace was in his heart, a peace and content so sweet he did not wish to move. Lingering beneath this content, he held a dim memory of a great anger, a horror of anger, when he saw red and hungered for blood. Vaguely it seemed to him now that all was as he wished it to be, with Cassandra near. He liked to feel her hand beneath his head, and her other hand upon his own, and her heavy bronze hair so close, and he closed his eyes once more to shut out all else, for the room was strange to him, this raftered place all whitewashed from ceiling to floor. He had forgotten what had happened, but Cassandra was there, and he was content. Something had touched his lips and brought him back, he was sure of that, and his weakly beating heart stirred to more vigorous action. He turned his head a little, a very little, toward her, and his fingers closed about her hand to hold it there. She lifted her head then, and they looked into each other's eyes, a long, deep look. Later, when Azalea entered, she found them both sleeping, Cassandra's hand still beneath his head, his face pressed to her soft hair, and his free arm flung about her. Azalea stole away and hurried with the news to old Sally, who also crept in and looked on them and stole away. "Yes, she sure have saved his life," said Sally. "Heap o' times they never do come out in that thar kind o' sleep. I done seed such before. If he have come to hisself, you reckon I better wake him up and give him a little hot milk? She ain't eat nothin' since yesterdday." "Naw, leave him be. Nobody never hain't starved in his sleep yet, I reckon." "He ain't eat nothin' neither. He sure have been bad hurted." The two women sat in the large room and talked in low tones, while at intervals Azalea crept to the door and looked in on them. At last the baby wailed out with lusty cry, which sounded through the stillness of the house and roused Cassandra, but as she lifted her head, David clung to her and drew her cheek to his lips. "Are you hurt?" he murmured. In some strange way he had confused matters and thought it was she who had been shot. "It's not me that's hurt," she said tenderly. Azalea hurried away and returned with the warm milk she had prepared for Cassandra, who took it and held it to David's lips. "Drink it, Doctor. She won't touch anything till you do." Then he obeyed, slowly drinking it all, his eyes fixed on Cassandra's as a child looks up to his mother. As she rose, he held her with his free hand. "What is it? How long?" His voice sounded thin and weak. "Strange. I can't lift this arm at all. Tell me." "Seems like I can't. When you are strong again, I will." Feebly he tried to raise himself. "Don't, oh, don't, Doctor Thryng. If you bleed again, you'll die," she wailed. "Sit near me." She drew a low chair and sat near him, as she had through the slow and anxious hours, and again he drowsed off, only to open his eyes from time to time, as if to assure himself that she was still there. Again Azalea brought her milk and white beaten biscuit, hot and sweet, and Cassandra ate. When David opened his eyes to look at her, she smiled on him and would not let him talk to her. Nevertheless, his mind was busy trying to understand why he was lying thus, and dimly the events of the last few days came back to him, shadowy and confused. When he looked up and saw her smile, his heart was satisfied, but when he closed his eyes again, a strange sense of tragedy settled down upon him, but what or why he knew not. Suddenly he called to her as if from his sleep. "Have I killed some one?" And there was horror in his voice. "No, no, Doctor Thryng. You been nigh about killed yourself. Oh, why didn't I send for a doctor who could do you right? Bishop Towers won't know anything about this." "What have you done?" "I sent for Bishop Towers." "Who did me up like this?" She was silent, and rising quickly stepped out on the porch, her cheeks flaming crimson. Yesterday, in her terror and frenzy, she could have done anything, but now, with his eyes fixed on her face so intently, she could not reply nor tell how alone she had stripped him to the waist and bound him about with the homespun cotton of her dress to stanch the bleeding before hurrying down the mountain for help. Instinctively she had done the right thing, and had done it well, but now she could not talk about it. David tried to call after her, but she had gone around into the next room and taken the baby from his cradle, where he was wailing his demands for attention. Azalea had gone out for a moment, and Aunt Sally "'lowed there warn't no use spilin' him by takin' him up every time he fretted for it. Hit would do him good to holler a stretch." So she sat still and smoked. Cassandra walked up and down the porch, comforted by the feeling of the child in her arms. The small head bobbed this way and that until she pressed it against her cheek and held him close, and he gradually settled down on her bosom, his face tucked softly in the curve of her neck, and slept. She heard David speaking her name and went to him, but he only looked up at her and smiled. "I'm sorry I left you alone," she said tenderly. "I'll call Aunt Sally." "No, wait. I only want to look at you." She stood swaying her lithe body to rock the sleeping child. David thought he had never seen anything lovelier. How serious his wounds were he did not know, but one thing he knew well, and to that one thing he clung. He wanted Cassandra where he could see her all the time. He wished she would talk to him, and not let him lose consciousness, relapsing into the horror of a strange dream that continued to haunt him. "Do you love that baby?" he asked, his voice faint and high. "He's a right nice baby." "I say, do you love him?" "Why, I reckon I do." "Don't try to move that way, Doctor. You may not be done right, and you'll bleed again. Oh, we don't know. We are so ignorant, Azalie and me." He smiled. "Nothing matters now," he said. They heard voices, and she looked out from the doorway. "It's Hoke. They've sent old Doctor Bartlett. I'm so glad. Aunt Sally, I reckon they'll need hot water. Get some ready, will you?" "Cassandra, Cassandra," called David almost irritably. She came back to him. "Where are they?" "Down the road a piece. I'm glad. You'll be done right now." "Stoop to me." She obeyed, and the free arm caught and held her. Then, as the voices drew near, released her with glowing eyes and burning cheeks. She stepped out on the porch to meet them, half hiding her face behind the babe in her arms, and old Doctor Bartlett, as he looked on her with less prejudiced and more experienced eyes, thought he too never had seen anything lovelier. "He's awake," said Cassandra quietly to Hoke, and the two men went to David. She carried the child back and asked Aunt Sally to wait on them, while she sat down in the low splint rocker, clinging to the little one and listening with throbbing nerves to the voices in the room beyond. When Hoke came out to them a moment later, Azalea began eagerly to question him, but Cassandra was silent. "Doctor says we better tote him over to his own place to day. Aunt Sally 'lows she can bide there for a while and see him well again." "You ain't goin' to 'low that, be you, Hoke? Hit mount look like we wa'n't willin' fer him to bide along of us." "Hit ain't what looks like. It's what's best for him," said Hoke sagely. "Whatever doctor says we'll do." Then Hoke laughed quietly. "He done told Doctor Bartlett 'at he reckoned somebody must have took him fer some sort o' wild critter and shot him by mistake. I guess Frale's safe enough from him if the fool boy only knowed it." "Frale, he's plumb crazy, the way he been a actin'," said Azalea. "And Bishop Towers he telegraphed 'at he'd send this here doctor, and he'd come up to morrer with Mis' Towers to stop over with you, So I reckon your ma wants you down there, Cass." Cassandra rose quickly and placed the sleeping child gently in his cradle box. "I'll go," she said. "There's no need for me here now. Hoke, you've been right good." She stopped abruptly and turned to his wife. "I must wear your dress off, Azalie, but I'll send it back by Hoke as soon as it's been washed." She went out the door almost as if she were eager to escape. "Hain't you going to wait for your horse?" said Hoke, laughing. "Set a minute till I fetch him." "I clean forgot," she said, and when he had left she turned to her friend. "Azalie, don't say anything to Hoke about us. Did Aunt Sally see? You know I didn't know myself until I woke and found myself there. I'd been trying to make him take a little whiskey, and I must have gone asleep like I was, and he woke up and must have felt like he had to kiss somebody, he was that glad to be alive." "Never you fret, child." Azalie smiled a quiet smile. "I'm not one to talk. Anyway, I reckon Doctor Thryng's about right. He sure have been good to me." The widow sat on her little stoop, waiting and watching as her daughter rode to the door and wearily alighted. "Cassandry Merlin, for the Lord's sake, what all is up now? Hoyle, where is that boy? Hoyle, come here and take the horse for sister. Be you most dead, honey? I reckon you be. You look like it." Cassandra kissed her mother and passed on into the house. "I couldn't send you word last night. Anyway, I reckoned you'd rest better if you didn't know, for we all thought Doctor Thryng was sure killed. Did Hope tell you this morning?" "I 'lowed you was stopping with Azalie, 'at maybe was sick or something, when Hoyle come up to the cabin and said doctor warn't there. Frale sure have done fer hisself. I reckon you are clear shet o' him now, and I glad you be, since he took to the idee o' marryin' with you. What all have he done the doctor this a way for? There warn't nothin' 'twixt him and the doctor. Pore fool boy he. I'll be glad fer your sake, Cass, if he'll quit these here mountains." "Oh, mother, mother, don't talk about me. Don't think of me. The doctor's nigh about killed, let alone the sin Frale has on him now." Wearied beyond further endurance, she flung herself on her bed and broke into uncontrollable sobbing, while Hoyle stood in the middle of the room and gazed with wide-eyed wonder. "Be the doctor dead, Ma?" he asked in an awed whisper. "No, child, no. You fetch a little light and chips, and we'll make her some coffee. Sister's that tired, poor child. Have you been up all night, Cass?" She nodded her head and still sobbed on. "He's gettin' on all right now, be he?" Again she nodded, but did not take her hands from her face. "Then you'd ought to be glad. Hit ain't like Frale had 'a' killed him. Farwell, he had many a time such as this with one and another, and he never come to no harm from it. I reckon Frale'll be safe. Be you cryin' for him, Cass? Poor child. I never did think you cared for Frale that a way." Then Cassandra burst forth with impetuous fire. "Oh, mother, mother, never say that name to me again. Mother, I saw them. I saw them fighting, and all the time the doctor was bleeding and dying where Frale had shot him. I don't know how long they'd been fighting, but I came there and I saw them. I saw him slip, and how Frale crushed him down, and how his head struck the rock. I saw, and I almost cursed Frale. I hope I didn't. Oh, I hope not. But mother, mother, don't ask me anything more now. Oh, I want to cry. I want to cry and never stop." While she lay thus weeping, the soft rain that had been threatening all day began pattering down, blessed and soothing, the rain to the earth and the tears to the girl. In spite of the rain, Thryng was carried home that afternoon according to the physician's orders and placed in his cabin with Aunt Sally to stand guard over him and provide for his wants. A bed was improvised for her on the floor of the cabin, while David lay in his own bed in his canvas room, bandaged about both body and head, and withal moderately comfortable, sufficiently himself to realize what had occurred, and overjoyed because of the reward his wounds had brought him. Dr. Bartlett came down to the Fall Place, and was given the bed in the loom shed as David had been, and had the pleasure of again seeing Cassandra, who, her tears dried and her manner composed, looked after his needs as if no storms had ever shaken her soul. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of The Mountain Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Estenson. The Mountain Girl by Payne Erskine. Chapter 19, in which David sends Hoke below on a commission and Cassandra makes a confession. Early one morning, Hoke Belew put his hand at the door of Thryng's cabin, where Aunt Sally was squatted before the fireplace, preparing breakfast for the patient. "How's Doc?" he asked. "He's right far. He mount be worse, and he mount be better." "You reckon I mount go in yonder whar he's at?" "Ye can look and see he's awake. I'm gettin' his hot bread and coffee. You better bide and have a leetle," she said, with ever-ready hospitality. He crossed the floor with careful steps and paused in the doorway of the canvas room, big and smiling. "That you, Hoke? Come in," said David cheerfully. He extended a hand, which Hoke took in his and held awkwardly, shocked at the white face before him. "You do look puny," he said at last, "but we uns sure be glad you're livin'. You told me to come early, so I come." "It's awfully good of you. Bring a chair and sit near so we can talk a bit. Now, Hoke, laid up here as I am, I need your help. I want to send you to Farrington or Lone Pine, somewhere. I don't know where such things are to be had, but, Hoke, you've been married and know all about what's needed here." "Ye want me to git ye a license, I reckon," said Hoke, grinning. "An' you mount send me a errant I'd like a heap worse, that's so. But what good will hit be to you now? You can't stand on your feet." "I can put it under my pillow and keep it to get well on. See here, Hoke, I don't even know if she'll marry me. She has not said so, but I'll be ready. You keep this quiet for me, Hoke, because it would trouble her if the whole mountainside should know what I have done before she does. Yet a girl like Cassandra is worth winning if you have to go to the edge of the grave to do it. So whenever she will have me, I want to be ready." They talked in low tones, Hoke leaning forward close to David, his elbows on his knees. "I reckon you're thinking to bide on here 'long o' we uns and not carry her off nowhere else?" he asked gravely. David's paleness left him for a moment as the warm tide swept up from his heart. "My home is not in this country, and wherever a man goes he expects to take his wife with him. Don't you people here in the mountains do the same?" "I reckon so, but hit would nigh about kill Azalie if she war to lose Cass. They've been friends ever since they war little uns." "Hoke, if you were to find it necessary to go away anywhere, would you leave your wife behind to please Cassandra Merlin?" The man was silent, and David continued. "Before you were married, if you had known there was another man, and a criminal at that, hanging around determined to get her, wouldn't you have married her out of hand as soon as you could get her consent? It's my opinion, knowing the sort of man you are, that you would." "I sure would." "Then you can understand why I wish to have a marriage license under my pillow." "I reckon so, but you all hain't our kind, not being kin to none of us. You understand me, suh. We uns are a proud people here, and we think a heap o' our women. Hit will be right hard should you git sorter tired o' Cassandry when you come to git her amongst your people, bein' she ain't like none o' your folks, understand? And Cassandry, she's sorter hard hit jest now. She don't rightly know what all she do think. Me and Azalie, we be speakin' right smart together, and, well, we do sure think a heap o' you, Doc, and hit ain't no disrespect to you uns neither. Have you said anything to her ma?" "Not a word. When I learned another man was before me, I stood one side as an honorable man should, and gave him his chance. But when it comes to being attacked by the other man and shot in the back, by heaven, no power on earth will hold me from trying to win her. As for the other matter, never you fear. Be my friend, Hoke." "Wal, I reckon you'll have your own way, and I mount as well git hit for ye. But I did promise Azalie 'at I'd speak that word to ye," said the young man, rising with an air of relief. "Tell your wife that you are both of you quite right, and that I am right also. Just hunt up my trousers, will you? I want my pocketbook. If I have to sign anything before anybody, bring 'em here. I don't care what you do so you get it. There, on that card you have it all, my full name and all that, you know." David tried to eat what Sally prepared for him, using his unbound hand, but his egg was hard, his coffee thick and boiled. He could not drink it very well, for his head was too low, and he could not raise himself. So he lay silent and uncomfortable, watching her move about his rooms, wearing her great black sunbonnet. She appeared kindly and pleasant when he could see her face, which was thin and very much lined, but motherly and good. He fell in the way of calling her Aunt Sally, as others did, and this seemed to please her. She treated him as if he were a big boy who did not know what was good for himself. She called all the green blossoming things with which Cassandra had adorned the cabin "thrash," and asked who had "toted hit thar." Waiting and listening, sure Cassandra would not leave him all day without coming to him, even though Aunt Sally had taken him in charge, David's mind was full of her. If he closed his eyes he saw her. If he opened them and watched Sally's meager form and black sunbonnet moving about, he thought what it might be to see Cassandra there. He could not and would not look at the future. The picture Hoke Belew had summoned up when he had suggested the taking of Cassandra away among people alien to her, he put from him. He would not see it or think of it. The present was his, and it was all he had, perhaps all he ever would have, and now he would not allow one little joy of it to escape him. He would be greedy of it and have all the gladness of the moments as they came. He could see her down below, making ready for their visitors, and he knew she would not come until the last task was done. But meantime his patience was wearing away. Aunt Sally finished her work, and David could see her from where he lay, seated in the doorway with her pipe, looking out on the gently falling rain. Without, all was very peaceful. Only within himself was turmoil and impatience, but he knew that to remain calm and unmoved was to keep back his fever and hasten recuperation. So he closed his eyes and tried to live for the moment in the remembrance of that awakening when he had found her kneeling at his side. Thus he dropped to sleep, and again when he awoke he found Cassandra there as if in answer to his silent call. She was seated quietly sewing, as if it were no unusual thing for her to visit him thus, and when his earnest gaze caused her to look up, she only smiled without perturbation and came to him. "I sent Aunt Sally down to see mother while I could stay by you and do for you a little," she said. Calm and restful she seemed, yet when he extended his free hand and took hers, he felt a tremor in her touch that delighted his heart. He brought it to his lips. "I've been needing you all morning. Aunt Sally has done everything, all she could. If I should let you have this hand again, would you go so far away from me that I could not reach you?" "Not if you want me near." "Then put away your sewing and bring your chair close to me, and let us talk together while we may." She obeyed and sat looking away from him out through the open door. Were her eyes searching for the mountain top? "You have thoughts, sweet, big thoughts, dear girl. Put them in words for me now, while we are so blessedly alone." "I can't say rightly what I think. Seems like if I had some other way, something besides words to tell my thoughts with, I could do better. But words are all we have, and seems like when I want them most they won't come." "That's the way with all of us. Don't you see you are still beyond my reach? Come, if you can't tell your thoughts in words, give them by the touch of your hands as you did a moment ago." She did as he bade her, leaning forward, took his hand in both her own. "That's right. I'll teach you how to tell your thoughts without words. Now, how came you to find us the other day?" "I don't know myself. It was a strange way. First I rode down to Teasley's mill to try to persuade them, Giles Teasley, to allow him to go free." She paused and put her hand to her throat, as was her way. "I think, Dr. Thryng, I'd better build up the fire and get you some hot milk. Dr. Bartlett said you must have it often, and to keep you very quiet." "Not until you tell me now, this moment, what I ask you. You went to the mill to try to help Frale out of his trouble. Cassandra, have you loved that boy?" Her face assumed its old look of mask-like impassivity. "I reckoned he might hold himself steady and do right would they only leave him be and give him the chance. Cassandra, answer me. Was it for love of him that you gave him your promise?" Her face grew white, and for a moment she bowed her head on his hand. "Please, Dr. Thryng, let me tell you the strange part first. Then you can answer that question in your own way." She lifted her head and looked steadily in his eyes. "You remember that day we went to Kate Irwin's, when we came to the place where we can see far, far over the mountains? I laughed with something glad in my heart. It was the same this time when I got to that far open place. All at once it seemed like I was so free, free from the heavy burden, and all in a kind of light that was only the same gladness in my heart. I stopped there and waited and thought how you said that time, 'It's good just to be alive,' and I thought if you were there with me and should put your hand on my bridle as you did that night in the rain, and if you should lead me away off, even into the valley of the shadow of death, into those deep shadows below us, I would go and never say a word. All at once it seemed as if you were doing that, and I forgot Frale and kept on, and wherever it seemed like you were leading me, I went. It seemed like I was dreaming, or feeling like a hand was on my heart, a hand I could not see, pulling me and making me feel, this way, I must go this way. I never had been where my horse took me before. I didn't think how I could ever get back again. I didn't seem to see anything around me, only to go on, and at last it seemed I couldn't go fast enough, until all at once I came to your horse tied there, and I heard strange trampling sounds a little farther on where my horse could not go, and I got off and ran. I fell and got up and ran again, and it seemed as if my feet wouldn't leave the ground, but only held me back. It seemed like they hadn't any more power to run, and then I came there and I saw." She paused, covering her face with her hand as if to shut out the sight, and slipped to her knees beside him. "Oh, I saw your faces, all terrible." He put his arm about her and drew her close. "I saw you fall, and your face when it seemed like you were dying as you fought. I saw—" Her sobs shook her and she could not go on. "My beautiful priestess of good and holy things," he said. She leaned to him then, placing her arms about him, ever mindful of his hurt. She lifted his head to her shoulder. The floodgates of her reserve once lifted, the full tide of her intense nature swept over him and enveloped him. It was as light to his soul and healing to his body. How often it had seemed as if he saw her with that halo of light about her, and now it was as if he had been drawn within its charmed radius, as surely he had. "And then, dear, what did you do?" "I thought you were killed, and almost I cursed him. I hope now I wasn't so wicked, but I called back from God the promise I had given him." "And then? Tell me all the blessed truth. And then?" "You were bleeding, and I took off your clothes, and I saw where you were bleeding your life away, and I tied my dress around you. I tore it in pieces and wound it all around you as well as I could, and then I put your coat back on you, and still you didn't waken. It seemed as if you had stopped breathing. And then I saw the bruise on your head, and I thought maybe you were only stunned. I brought water from the branch and put your head on the wet cloth and bound it all around, but still you looked like he had killed you. And then—" He stirred in her arms to feel their clasp. "And then?" "Then I went for help," she said, in so low a tone it seemed hardly spoken. "First you did something you have not told me." She waited in a sweet shame he recognized and gloried in, but he wanted the confession from her lips. "And then?" "You said you would teach me to say things without words," she said tremulously. "Not now. Later. Put everything you did in words. And then—" "I thought you were dying." She drew in a long, sighing breath. "And you kissed me. I have a right to know, for I missed them all." I did," she cried vehemently. 100 times I kissed you. I had called my promise back from God, and I dared it. I wasn't ashamed. I would have done it if all the mountainside had been there to see. But afterwards, when that strange doctor from Farrington came, and I knew he must uncover you and find my torn dress around you, somehow, then I felt I didn't want for him to look at me, and I was glad to go away." "Do you want to know what he said when he saw it?" "Whoever did this kept you alive, young man. So you see how you are my beautiful bringer of good. You are— oh, I have only one arm now. I'm at a disadvantage. When I can stand on my feet, I will pay them all back, those kisses you threw away on me then. We shan't need words then, dearest. I'll teach you the sweetest lesson. Your arms tremble. They're tired, dear. Could you let your head rest here and sleep as you did the other day? To think how I woke and found you beside me sleeping. Let me go now. I have things I ought to do for you. Not yet. I have things I must say to you. Please, Dr. Thring. My name is David. You must call me by it. Please, Dr. David, let me go. Why? To warm some milk. I brought it up for you. Pity we must eat to live. Then if I let you take your arms away, will you come back to me? Yes, I'll bring the milk. There, go. I'm giving you your own way because I know I will recover the sooner the strength I have lost. A man flat on his back but with one arm free is no good. But you don't let me go. Listen, Cassandra. You brought me back to life. Do you know what for? What did your father tell you? That one should be sent for you? It is I, dearest. From away over on the other side of the earth I have come for you. We fought like beasts, Frale and I. I had given you up. You, Cassandra, had said in my heart, I will go away and leave her to the one she has chosen, if that be right. And even at that moment Frale shot me and sprang upon me, and I fought. I was glad the chance was given me there in the wilderness, in that old and primitive way, to settle it and win you. I put all the force and strength of my body into it, and more, all the strength of my love for you. It was with that in my heart we clinched. I said, I will fight to the death for her. She shall be mine, whether I live or die. Stop crying, sweet. Be glad as I am. Give thanks that it was to the life and not to the death. Listen once more while I can feel and know. Give way to your great heart of love and treat me as you did after you had bound up my wounds. Learn the sweet lesson I said I would teach you. Late that evening, Hoke Ballou ran up to the door of David's cabin and called Aunt Sally out to speak with him. "How's Doc?" "He's doing right well. He's asleep now. Won't ye light and come in?" "I reckon not. Azalie, she's been alone all day, and I guess she'll be some feared. Will you put that thar under Doc's pillow whar he can find hit in the mornin'? Hit's a paper he sent me for. Tell him I reckon hit's all straight. He can see. Them people Cassandry was expectin' from Farrington. Did they come by today?" "Yas, they come. They're down to Mis' Farwell's." "Will you tell Doc 'at Azalie and me will be here 'long 'leven in the mornin'?" Hoke rode off under the winking stars, for the clouds after the long day of rain had lifted, and in the still night were rolling away over the mountain tops. Aunt Sally slipped quietly back into the cabin and softly closed the door of the canvas room, lest the rustling of paper should waken her charge, for she meant to examine that paper, quite innocently, since she could neither read nor write, but out of sheer childish curiosity. She need not have feared waking David, however, for all his physical discomfort forgotten, dominated by the supreme happiness that possessed him, yet weak in body to the point of exhaustion, he slept profoundly and calmly on, even when she came stealthily and slipped the paper beneath his pillow, as Hoke had requested. End of chapter 19. Chapter number 20 of The Mountain Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Estenson. The Mountain Girl by Payne Erskine. Chapter 20, in which the bishop and his wife pass an eventful day at the Fall Place. "Do you know, James," said Betty Towers as she walked at her husband's side in the sweet morning, slowly climbing up to David's cabin from the Fall Place, "I feel almost vexed with you for never bringing me here before." "Why, my dear?" "Yes, I do. To think of all this loveliness. And for 6 years you've been here many times and never once told me you knew a place hardly 2 hours away as entrancing as heaven. Even now, James, if it hadn't been for Cassandra, I wouldn't have come. Why, it's the loveliest spot on earth. Stand still a minute, James, and listen. That's a thrush. Oh, something smells so sweet. It's a locust, and that's a redbird's note. There he is, like a red blossom in those bushes. There, no, there. You will look in the wrong direction, James, and now he's gone. You remember what David Thring wrote? It's good just to be alive. He's always saying that. And now I understand, in such a place as this. Oh, just breathe the air, James." "I certainly can't help doing that, dear." The bishop was puffing a little over the climb his slight young wife took so easily. "I don't care. Here I've lived in the cities all my life, while you have lived down here, and it has lost its charm to you. Only think of all this gorgeous display of nature just for these mountain people, and what it is to them." "To them it's the natural order of things, just as you implied in regard to me." "Hark, James. Now that's a catbird." "And not a thrush?" "The other was a thrush. I know the difference." "Wise little woman. Come, there's that young man getting up a fever by fretting. I said we would come early." "James, I'm going to stay up here and let you go to that stupid wedding down in Farrington without me." "Perhaps we have something interesting up here if you'll hurry a little." "What is it, James?" "I can't really say, dear." She took his hand and they walked on. "Wouldn't this be an ideal spot to spend a honeymoon? Hear that fall away down below us? How cool it sounds. Why don't you pay attention to me? What are you thinking about, James?" "I'm making a little poem for you, dear. Listen. Chatter, chatter, little tongue, what a wonder how you're hung up above the epiglottis, tied on with a little knottis." "Only geniuses may be silly, James, but perhaps you can't help it. I think married people ought to establish the custom of sabbatical honeymoons to counteract the divorce habit. Suppose we set the example, now we have arrived at just the right time for one, and spend ours here." "Anything you say, dear." Being an absent-minded man, the bishop had fallen in the way of saying that, when, had he paused to think, he would have admitted that everything was made to bend to his will or wish by the spirited little being at his side. Moreover, being an absent-minded man, he drew her to him and kissed her. Aunt Sally, watching them from the cabin door, wondered if the bishop were going away on a journey to leave his wife behind, for why else should he kiss her thus? "Will you sit there on the rock and enjoy the mountains while I see how he is?" said the bishop. So they parted at the door, and Aunt Sally brought her a chair and stood beside her, giving her every detail of the affair as far as she knew it. She sat bareheaded in the sun, to Sally's amazement, for she had her hat in her lap and could have worn it. The wind blew wisps of her fine straight hair across her pink cheeks and in her eyes, as she gazed out upon the blue mountains and listened to Sally's tale of how it all come about. for Sally went back into the family history of the Teasleys and the Caswells and the Merlins and the Farwells, until Betty forgot the flight of time, and the bishop called her. Then she went in to see David. He had worked his right hand free from its bandages, and was able to lift it a little. She took it in hers and looked brightly down at him. "Dr. Thring, you look better than when you were in Farrington, doesn't he, James? Aunt Sally gave me to understand you were nearly dead." David laughed happily. "I was, but I'm very much alive now. I'm to be married, Mrs. Towers. Our wedding is to be quite comme il faut. It is to be at high noon, and the ceremony performed by a bishop." "James!" Betty dropped into a chair and looked helplessly at her husband. "You haven't your vestments here." "I have all I need, dear. You know, Doctor, from Mr. Below's telegram we were led to expect—" "A death instead of a wedding," David finished. Betty turned to him. "Why didn't you tell us when you were down? You never gave the slightest hint of your state of mind. And there I was with my heart aching for Cassandra, when you stood ready to save her. I'm so glad for Cassandra. I could hug you, Dr. Thring." Suddenly she turned on her husband. "James, have you thought of everything, all the consequences? What will his mother and the family over in England say?" James threw up his hand and laughed. "Don't laugh, James. Have you thought this all out, Doctor? Are you sure you can make them understand over there? Won't they think this is awfully irregular? Will they ever be reconciled? I know how they are. My father was English." "They never need be reconciled. It's our affair, and there's nothing to call me back there to live. What I do, or whom I make my wife, is nothing to them. I may visit my mother, of course, but for the rest, they gave me up years ago, when I had no use for the life they mapped out for me. I have nothing to inherit there. It would go to my older brother anyway. I may follow my own inclination, thank God. And as for its being irregular, on the contrary, we are distinguished enough to have a bishop perform the ceremony. That will be considered a great thing at home, when they do come to hear of it." "But it is very sudden, Doctor. I suppose that's why I said irregular." Betty Towers paused a moment with a little frown, then laughed outright. "Does Cassandra know she is to be married to-day?" "She learned the fact yesterday, incidentally. Bless her. And her only objection was a most feminine one. She had no proper dress. She said she was wearing her best when she found me, but I told her the trousseau was to come later." Betty rose with impulsive importance. "Well, James, we've so little time. I must go and help her prepare. And you'll rest now, won't you, Doctor? You stay up here with him, James, and I'll find some way of sending your things up." "Thar's Hoyle. He can help a piece. He can ride the mule and tote anything ye like. And Slarthy, I reckon ye can get her up here on my horse. Hit's thar at her place," said Sally, who had been standing in the doorway, keenly interested. When they were alone, she said to David, "Hit's a right quare way o' doin' things, gettin' married in bed. But if Bishop does do it, hit sure must be all right. Leastways, Cassandry'll think so." David took the superintendence of the arrangement of his cabin upon himself, and Hoke Belew, with the bishop's aid, carried out his directions. One side of his canvas room was rolled to the top, leaving the place open to the hills and the beauty without. His bed was placed so that he might face the open space, and that Cassandra could kneel at his right side. His writing table, draped with a white cloth and covered with green hemlock boughs, formed the altar. It was all very quickly and simply done, and then David lay quiet, with closed eyes, listening to his musicians in the treetops, fluting their own gladness, while Hoke Belew went down below, and the bishop sat out on the rock and meditated. Cassandra came up to the cabin alone, and sat with David while the bishop donned his priestly vestments, and the wedding procession wound slowly up the trail from the Fall Place, decorously and gravely, clad in their best. Azalea and Betty came side by side. The mother rode Sally's speckled white horse, and Little Hoyle ran on ahead. Hoke carried his baby in his arms. Behind them all rode Uncle Jerry Carew, full of the liveliest interest and curiosity. Said David, "This is May Day. I know what they're doing at home now, if the weather will let them. They're having gay times with out-of-door fetes. The country girls are wearing their prettiest gowns, and the men are wearing sprigs of may in their buttonholes. Where did you get your roses?" "Azalie brought them." "Who put them in your hair?" "Mrs. Towahs did that." "Do you like me this way?" "You're the loveliest being my eyes ever rested on." "This was my best dress last year. I did it up and mended it this morning. It's home woven like the other one you said you liked." David smiled, looking up into the gray eyes with the green lights and blue depths in them. How serene and poised her manner was, on the verge of the momentous step she was about to take, while his own heart was beating high. He wondered if she really comprehended the change it was to make in her life, that she showed no apprehension or fear. "Cassandra, do you realize in 15 minutes you will be my wife? It will be a great change for you, dearest. In spite of all I can do, you may be sad sometimes, and I may ask of you things you don't want to do." "I've been sad already in my life, and done things I didn't want to do. I don't guess you could change that. Only God could." "And you don't feel in the least disturbed? Your heart doesn't beat any harder nor breath come quicker? Tell me how you feel." She smiled and drew a long breath. "I don't know how it is. Everything is right peaceful and sweet outside. The sky and the hills and all the birds. Even the wind is still in the trees, like everything was waiting for something good to happen." "In your heart, is it sweet and peaceful too, and waiting for something good to happen?" "Yes, David." "God forgive me if I ever fail you," he said, drawing her down to him. "God make me worthy of you." Then the bishop entered, and the little procession followed and gathered about while the solemn words of the service were uttered. Cassandra knelt at David's side as together they partook of the bread and wine, and with the worn circlet of gold which had been tied to her father's little green books, they were pronounced man and wife. Then, rising from her knees, she bent and kissed David, the long first kiss of the wedded pair, and turned her gravely happy face to the bishop, who admitted to Betty afterward that he had never kissed a bride other than his own with such unalloyed satisfaction. It was all over quickly, and Cassandra was standing in a new world. Her eyes shone with the love light no longer held back and veiled. She accompanied them all to the door and parted from them, even her mother and little Hoyle, as a hostess parting from her guests. She would not allow any one to stay behind, for the wedding feast had been spread in her mother's house, and thither they repaired to eat and talk everything over. Mother felt right bad to leave us alone. She meant to bring everything up and all eat together here, but I thought it would be better just we two, and me to set things out for you. Lie quiet and close your eyes, David, and make out like you're sleeping while I do it." With perfect contentment he obeyed and lay watching her through half-closed lids. It was always the same vision. She moved between him and a halo of light that seemed to be part of her and go with her, now at his bedside, now bending before the fireplace. At last the small pine table, which had served as an altar, was set with their first meal. The home was established. He opened his eyes and looked at the feast she had set before him. The pink rose was still in her hair, and one at her throat, and two perfect ones were in a glass near his plate. The table was drawn close to his bedside, and strawberries were upon it, and a glass pitcher of cream. There were white beaten biscuit and tea, as he had made it for her so long ago on her first and only visit to his cabin when he was at home. So she had made it for him now. There were chicken and green peas also. How quickly everything has happened! How perfect it all is! How did you get all these things together? So she told him where everything came from. Mother churned the butter to have it right fresh, and she left it without salt for you, like you said you used to have it in England. Uncle Jerry brought the peas from his garden and shelled them himself. I made the biscuit this morning, and Aunt Sally fried the chicken when she came down, and Azalie prepared the peas, and we all kept them hot in the fireplace, theirs down there and ours up here." Cassandra laughed merrily. "I reckon it looked funny. Everyone carried something when they came up. Hoyle had the peas in a tin pail, and Mother rode Aunt Sally's Speckle and carried the biscuit in a pan in front. Shut your eyes and you can see them come that way, David, while I sit here with you, talking and feeling that happy. Don't try to use your right hand that way. I can see it hurts you. Let me go on feeding you like I am. Don't I do it right?" "Perfectly. But I want you to bring that cushion over here and put it under my pillow so I won't have to lift my head. That's right. Now I want to see you eat. You can't feed me and yourself at the same time. You won't? Then we'll take it turnabout. How have you managed these days? Did Aunt Sally feed you? Oh, I don't believe you ate anything. You couldn't, could you?" She spoke so sadly he laughed. "It's a lucky thing you sent for the bishop instead of the doctor, or I would have no wife and would have starved to death. I couldn't have survived another day." Again she laughed out, as she seemed so suddenly to have learned to do. "And I would have stayed away and let you starve to death? You must open your mouth, David, and not try to talk now. Ah, no, that's enough. We've 1,000 things to say and plans to make. You eat while I talk. When I am up, we must find someone to stay with your mother. She should not be left alone." Cassandra paled a little. He was watching her face. "You will be staying up here with me, you know, all the time." "Yes, I know." Her throat seemed to tighten, and she looked off towards the hills, as was her way. "Don't you like the thought of staying up here with me? Make your confession, dearest one." He drew her down to look in his eyes. "It's done. We are man and wife." Her eyes swam with tears, but her lips smiled. I do want to bide with you. All the way before me now looks like a long path of light, like what I've dreamed sometimes when the moon shines long, the mists at night. Only one place I can't quite see. It is shadow or not. Perhaps it's only the thought of Mother down there alone." She spoke dreamily and with the same look of seeing things beyond, except that now she fixed her eyes not on the mountain top, but on his own. Is it in my eyes you see the long path of light? Are we together in it? I see you always with the light about you. I saw you so first in your own home before the blazing fire, such a hearth fire as I have never seen before. You have appeared to me in my dreams with light about you ever since, and in my visions when I've been riding over these hills alone. What are you seeing now? You, as you helped me that first time there in the snow. You looked so ill, but your way was strong, and I thought, all at once in a flash, like it came from Goon, like it came from my father. One will come for you. She hid her face in his bosom, and her words came smothered and brokenly. All the ride home I put them away, but they would come back, his words, on the mountain top. One will come for you. But we were in such trouble. I thought it was just the thought of my father. It's always strongest when trouble comes, like he would comfort me. Don't you have it also when happiness comes to you, as on this morning while we waited together? No great happiness like this ever came before. I have been glad, like when mother said I might go to Farrington to school, and when I knelt and was confirmed. I was glad then. The first gladness I can remember was when my father used to carry me in his arms up and down his path and repeat strange poetry to me. When you are well, we will go there, won't we? Yes, dearest. But didn't that remembrance come to you just now, when you saw the long path of light before us? I think no, David. I'm afraid I forgot everyone but you then, when you asked would I like to bide here with you? And the long path of light was our love, for it reaches up to heaven. Doesn't it, David? It reaches to heaven, Cassandra. They were silent, for there was no more to say. End of chapter 20. Recording by Sandra Estenson.